Hello, everybody. This is the SIG Cluster Lifecycle meeting. Today is the 23rd of March, 2021. I'm going to share the agenda document in chat. Please add your names to the list of participants and any agenda topics that you may have. Okay. Rajashri, you are at your name as a new participant. You want to present yourself?
Hi, yeah, sure. Hey everyone, I'm Rajeshri and I work at AWS. I recently started learning about Cluster API and using it, so I'm still fairly new to it. And I just wanted to attend one of the meetings and discuss the KEP that I have linked there.
Okay. Maybe we can talk about this now. So basically, this is the original KEP for HCD ADM, I believe. Yes. So HCD ADM is still an alpha state project. It has its own repository, but we are not using it in kubeadm or projects like Cluster API yet. The idea is one day we should do that because currently some of these cluster lifecycle projects that we have, they use their own method of deploying HCD. And long term, we want HCD ADM to be this single tool that we use everywhere. So basically, you're interested in Cluster API and you want to start using HCD ADM. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. And for that, I'm more than happy to work on a POC to just see how it will look like. Yeah, and I had written a few things down based on what I've seen so far, like an idea of how we can add a bootstrap provider that uses HCD ADM, like just like we have one for kubeadm.
I see. Do you have some sort of a Google Doc that is, I assume that it's following the Cluster API proposal format?
Actually, no. So I haven't reached it's pretty rough right now. I do have a Google Doc, but it's not following the format that Cluster API proposals use. I can definitely clean it up and turn it into that format, but I can still share that Google Doc right now. Is that okay?
I, yes, you can. I guess you can briefly present it to us if you want. Do you want me to give you access to share the screen?
Yeah, sure. Um,
Just a second.
mhm.
Okay, you should be able to.
Okay. Okay, I hope you all can see my Google Docs screen.
Yes.
And okay, so what I was thinking is we could add a separate bootstrap provider using it that will use HCD ADM to bring up an HCD only cluster. Because from what I've seen, Cluster API right now doesn't provision and manage an external HCD only cluster, right? Um, so for that, this is a very rough initial idea. And a lot of my time just went in understanding how Cluster API works because I haven't worked with it before. So we could have an object HCD ADM config. From what I know of HCD ADM, the init and join commands, like the way I have set up an external cluster, an HCD cluster using that, it didn't require a lot of additional configuration, but I had to pass in the server cert sans to provide public IP addresses of the nodes that I was creating so that I could use them as endpoint while talking to the HCD cluster. And the certificates directory, I just added it in because of how the bootstrap provider will work. So the initial idea will be the same, that whenever we start provisioning this cluster, each machine or node will try to acquire the lock, which will decide which becomes the first HCD node. Once any node acquires the log, we will use the init configuration to generate the etcd ADM command. And we will also have to store the, okay, so this is here where I'm a little confused. So I know that the etcd ADM init command generates the CA cert and all the certs, server, peer, client certs for each node. And we have to generate the CA cert from the first node and copy it over to the rest of the nodes that want to join the cluster. But I don't think we can do that, right? Because that would involve like copying the certs that were created on the first node and then like copying them over to the other nodes. So I was thinking that cluster API itself can generate the certs and can generate the CA cert, and then we can like create the init configuration with the certificates directory field. Sorry, I don't know if this is making sense or I'm just rambling on, but okay. The CA cert is generated by cluster API, and the bootstrap data secret that we generate, that will contain the commands like write files and run cmd. And write files will basically tell to will contain the exact CA cert key pair and the path where it should be copied over. And then I think if this node runs etcd ADM init, like it will use the CA cert key pair to generate all of its own certs, server, peer, and client certs. So I think that should be fine. Any questions, suggestions, or anything till now?
Yeah, something useful to follow the Cluster API template for proposals is that people looking at this will be able to understand like where you're coming from, like what is the use case, why we want to do that. So in terms of the certificates, the CA in particular that etcd uses should be ideally signed by the private key of the root CA that is in the cluster. And if you're using the kubeadm bootstrap provider, the kubeadm bootstrap provider generates that private key. So somehow the etcd CA has to be signed by it as well. So there has to be some sort of synchronization between these bootstrap providers if they use synchronously.
Okay, so just so I'm getting it right, the kubeadm provider generates like it generates the root CA, and etcd secret key needs to be signed by that.
Yes, there's also another case where the root CA could be external. So somebody feeds the root CA externally. I think there's a proposal, a work in progress for that in Cluster API. So basically, whatever method we use for the root CA, this root CA has to also sign the etcd CA.
Okay. So how does that, like, okay, I don't know how does that work. Is there something that I can read for that, or?
Okay, I think the first thing you can do is you can create an issue in the Cluster API repository. And so tomorrow there's a Cluster API meeting. You can present this initial state of your proposal. You can start transitioning to the new proposal template that is for Cluster API proposals. And when people see this proposal, they can also give you feedback. They can try explaining you how the kubeadm bootstrap provider works, and maybe you can get some ideas from the Cluster API maintainers. But basically, I would like to understand. I have some questions, but I see Justin has his hand up. Justin, go ahead, please. We cannot hear you, Justin.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Sorry about that. I think this is super exciting. I think just to give you a bit of background on the etcd ADM project, we started that with like merging two projects, one of which I see Daniel here, like Platform 9 has the etcd ADM like command line tool, and then the KOps project was building something called, or is building something called etcd manager. We are very close to merging the two of them. The way I would describe the goal is that etcd ADM will be sort of the CLI or interactive tool, and then etcd manager will become a sort of self-driving layer on top that will automate some of those things. Currently, they aren't entirely integrated. We are, I think, at the stage where we're very close to being able to build and run etcd manager from the etcd ADM repo. They're all the code is in one repo, and we'll soon be able to switch the sort of canonical location to that repo. So that's where we are in terms of, and then we can start unifying like the behaviors. If you look at etcd manager, how it works, it does sort of a lot of this sort of like complicated lock mutex stuff and like sort of leader election to try to orchestrate some of these things and manage that. So this makes a lot of sense. I think one of the things I think is interesting is in the case of cluster API, a lot of that work that etcd manager does, it could be greatly simplified because we actually have, so a lot of the work that etcd manager does is trying to construct a leader election protocol without anything really to work with. And in the case of cluster API, we are running on a Kubernetes cluster. And so you could imagine writing this as a controller that runs in the management cluster that runs etcd ADM or orchestrates etcd ADM on the machines that are brought up. That may be, and then that might be easier in terms of copying things around. But if you want to like, if you look at etcd manager and how it integrates into KOps, it probably has the same sort of flows that you need to do here. KOps doesn't currently use kubeadm, so there will be some differences. But in terms of the general like flow of the CA certificates, like we pre-create the various CA certificates externally, copy them in, and then each etcd or API server node is able to generate and sign using the CA key pair. So they have access to that, which is sort of the requirement.
Okay, so for this, I was following what the kubeadm bootstrap provider does, and it also seems to be a controller like CRD plus controllers running on the management cluster. So I think that is what you were also saying, right? Like running a similar controller that uses etcd ADM instead. And for the part of signing the, like providing an external root CA and having keys signed by that, you said I can refer etcd manager for getting an understanding of how that's done.
Yes, I mean, COPS or KOps and etcd manager are sort of combined to do that. But I mean, I think the long and the short of it is we create a CA key pair in a sort of central phase in the COPS create cluster stage, and we write it to a bucket, and then the etcd manager processes download those and use the key pair. So that's how we avoid the need to copy if you generate the CA cert key pair on a particular node, you have to copy them around. Instead, you can pre-generate it and like copy it to each one of them.
Yeah, okay. So I think that's something that I was thinking, that the CA cert will be generated by cluster API on the management cluster. And then this write files part of the bootstrap data script will contain the contents of it. Okay, I can definitely go through how COPS does it and like understand it better. Yeah. And so should I go ahead or should I wait to like clean this up and then discuss this in tomorrow's meeting instead?
Yeah, I propose that you should communicate the implementation details with the cluster API maintainers and like create the issue, extend this proposal to follow the template. Something interesting that we have to discuss with them is also the kubeadm configuration has to be configured with external etcd. Have you looked at the kubeadm cluster configuration structure?
Yes.
Yeah, if you Google kubeadm v1 beta 2 or v1 beta 1, you should get a cluster configuration object that supports etcd as a key, and then under etcd there's external or local. So in local, this means the etcd is managed by kubeadm, the kubeadm bootstrap provider, exactly.
Mhm.
So it's deployed as a static pod on the machine that has the control plane. In this case, etcd has to be external, and there's a key to configure this. Like you basically pass the external addresses where the API server should connect to.
Mhm.
So there has to be, I'm not sure, there has to be a way for the bootstrap provider of kubeadm to be configured to use the external etcd. I think it's already supported, but you have to check it with the maintainers.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I had seen the local and external options that you were talking about, and I somehow thought that they are there for the kubeadm config as well. But it's not there, is it? Like that needs to be added?
Uh, so I guess the only question is, can we do this from Cluster API? Does the Cluster API bootstrap provider for kubeadm support changing this field so that you can set up external etcd?
Okay. Yeah, I thought that's like I thought that that had the options for local versus external etcd. Um, but I can look into that, and then I can also add that to the proposal, like based on what I find.
Yeah, basically, this is something to investigate. Once you extend the proposal, people will review it from the Cluster API project.
Okay, okay. So I actually, yeah, so like since I've never done attended any of the meetings or presented anything before, I didn't know the agenda purpose of this meeting. So that's why I wrote this all up and I'm presenting this. But I think the right thing to do is like clean this up and like maybe bring it up in tomorrow's meeting and also open a GitHub issue. Um, I I still had a few questions, but like if I shouldn't ask them right now, like if we have other things to discuss, then I can ask them tomorrow.
Yeah, I see that Tim has his hands up. Tim, can you ask a question?
I was just going to move to like solutioneering on the call probably isn't the best use of everybody's time because you're going to have to go. We would be the stakeholders that be making the change. The cluster API folks would. So I think presenting that you have a proposal and getting eyes on is usually the modus operandi, and then it'll go through a review process. So it'll take a while to get the ball rolling, but I think that's the appropriate venue. I think if there's, general time at the end, if people want to hang out and sort of talk about the nitty gritty horrors and details of etcd management, then that's totally fine too.
Sure. So just last question, like this is definitely something that the cluster API project would want to use, right? Like a separate external etcd provider.
Potentially, it doesn't necessarily need to be in cluster API proper. So like one of the things I was thinking about is there's no reason why this couldn't exist on its own and just be used or leveraged potentially by some in a cluster API management cluster. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be part of the project itself. So I think bring it up with them and they'll probably give you some good feedback. And I'm sure there's some stakeholders that are interested in doing this because there are people who want to be able to spin up remote separate etcd clusters. Not everybody wants to do that for a number of reasons. So I think that would be a good conversation to have, and then they'll find a happy landing zone for this work.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, from the perspective of the whole SIG, I think this is something that we want to support somehow due to the architecture diagram that we have etcd being used, etcd IDM being used in kubeadm and all the other projects. But again, since you're targeting cluster APIs in your initial proposal, you just have to talk to the maintainers there. I don't see architectural problems. It's important to talk about the use cases, like the user stories in the template that you should talk about, like why do we need this, like what is the use case. It's important for people to understand that.
Okay, thanks.
No problem. But let me share my screen again to go through the rest of the agenda. Okay, I only have one group topic. That's the Kubernetes performance regression fix might be on hold for the initial release of 121. Derek made a comment here that he is concerned that this should take more time to soak into the CI before we merge it in for 121. So he's proposing that we merge this to 122 and then we backport it. I personally have no objection to that. I mean, I can create an argument that the original breaking change that was merged didn't soak in CI at all. So now we are creating an argument that it should soak in CI. I guess what they're saying is that 121.0 will not have the fix, but we can backport it as a critical bug fix later to 1.21.1. Does everybody
This
have
is like you're playing devil's gambit on this one in particular. It is not normal to introduce a regression into a new minor series, right? It seems, what's the release time frame for 121? Like, what are we talking about for soak time? Like, what's the lead time we have?
So code freeze, we are already in code freeze. Test freeze, which was the period discussed to merge this change before, is this Thursday. So if you want to make an argument for the point, the second point that Derek proposed, now is the time. So if you have any comments, like just drop them here. I completely agree with you. This, we are doing some interesting stuff with respect to this change. Releasing a minor release with this performance regression is very confusing. And
Yeah, I would vote against it. What's the issue number against pull 9936? All right, I'll comment.
yeah, if anybody has comments, just drop them on the issue. I'm sure a lot of people do not agree with delaying this to 122. Immediately somebody commented, hey, how about 118? We need to backport it everywhere. It is a change. For those that do not know, we regressed in the kubelet in terms of how fast it starts up. And nobody tested how fast we start in the kubelet, and then the change was backported to all the support releases. So basically, this problem is now present in all versions of Kubernetes, of the kubelet specifically. And that's why we had this PR that it fixes the problem, but the argument is that it's now touching critical paths that we need more time to test. But yeah, if somebody wants this change, just comment. We can try to get it in for 121. Okay, any more comments on this particular topic? Cool. Moving to sub-project updates, I added one item for kubeadm. It has been a bit slow for kubeadm. We are in code freeze. The release is looking good for kubeadm, nothing special. Something interesting that somebody created a cap for a kubeadm control plane run as non-root. To provide some context here, currently kubeadm runs the kube API server scheduler controller manager as root in the containers managed by the kubelet. Basically, the cap is proposing that we stop doing that and start implementing a way for the user to configure what user to use in those containers. Basically, the cap is in a very early stages. I added a lot of comments on this because the contributors skipped most of the important sections. Like, for instance, we're missing user stories. I see Vince added comments again. We are missing some caveats here. Risk and mitigation. Like there are a lot of interesting aspects to this. For instance, the KEP is proposing that we pin the UID and GID to 2000. Like what happens if on the host machine we have a user that is already with the same UID? This means that we grant him access to view these, to view the CA key, which is probably the most important artifact that we generate. So yeah, I have some interesting questions here. Basically, I requested from the contributor to break down all the mounts that we mount in the static pods and explain what is their idea for the permissions and the ownage of these artifacts. And this was my biggest request. If you have comments, please drop them here. This will affect, KubeSpray, Cluster API, and everybody using Kubedium. And eventually, we're going to request a security review from SIG Security as well. Does anybody have comments for this? All right, moving ahead. Sorry.
I think it's good. So we've talked about this a number of times. Like other people do this. Like I know Gardner does this. So I think it's good.
Yeah, definitely. Everybody wants this. I'm not sure. Like we have to do the security review thoroughly because it's important to not grant random users access to the artifacts. Okay, moving to HCADM, Justin.
Yes, I mean, I think we touched on this before, but just to say that we are making progress on moving KOps's canonical etcd manager location to the etcd ADM repo and Kubernetes infrastructure. Like that was mentioned last time, I think by Micah, and I think there are some PRs up, and hopefully, maybe with lots of luck, touch wood, like in 2 weeks, we will be running from the Kubernetes infrastructure coming from etcd ADM. So that will be a good step towards the unification. I don't know if Daniel has anything he wants to add, but yeah, that was.
Nope. Second what Justin said. Yeah.
Oh, do you have any plans to graduate etcd ADM to beta anytime soon?
I mean, I think, for instance, with AWS showing interest, I think, yeah, I mean, I guess it's sort of maybe a similar story with Cluster API, right? But it's important to get user feedback. I think before sort of stabilizing maybe the project more. So if as we hear from more users, that'll give us the confidence that okay, we're sort of we're on the right track. So yeah, I think I'm not in a hurry to change the status, but yeah. At the same time, you're showing the roadmap. It's I would say slow progress on that. But I guess that's maybe different than beta, like having a beta label.
Yeah, I think that to get the project going faster, we should try to get more contributors to actually contribute to the code base of the project. Like I said, I think Google Summer of Code, the CNCF mentoring, presenting at KubeCon, these are ways to get more contributors. Maybe people can start joining the meeting, assigning themselves to drafting a configuration file format, support for static pods, some of the things if I guess a lot of things are driven by demand. For instance, if AWS contributors want to use this, maybe they can help contributing to some of the items in the roadmap of the project. I think it's usable today. Just a question is like whether this particular roadmap is a graduation criteria for the beta, or is this like a general a general roadmap for the future of the project?
That's a good question. Yeah, I don't think that I had that in mind, or we had that in mind. But that's a good question. Probably a subset of these things could qualify, I guess moving to beta. API types, probably so actually some work has happened to support running etcd in static pods in the service of etcd manager, and so that could probably be another
if I mean, I'd agree with this. I think beta is when we API type beta. I don't know whether you're saying API type beta or product beta, but API type beta is when we have reasonable confidence in the schema not changing. I think this is a good list of things that we would want to have before we locked the schema. I don't know whether we would consider going to beta before the schemas were in beta, but that just seems unnecessarily confusing.
Yeah, it's also a matter of the COI flags themselves being an API. When we start using them in other projects, it's also important to say, okay, these flags are beta at least. If they're alpha, I don't know what is a COI guarantee and whether etcd ADM follows the official K3 Kubernetes API graduation process. But if something is alpha and the whole COI is alpha, this means that flags can be changed without any deprecation. So if Cluster API starts using the flags for etcd ADM at the moment, it's a question whether the project is going to provide some guarantees to external consumers.
And there's
But
an adoption guarantee too, like for better or for worse, like in SIG Cluster Lifecycle, we've been pretty conservative for good reason, right? Like people are depending upon the APIs. So our alpha APIs are really, they're much stronger guarantees than the rest of Kubernetes APIs, because if we break somebody, you hear about it everywhere on Slack, on Twitter, that you know it immediately. So promoting to beta is a good thing to do, and I've been pushing Vince and company to start to get the roadmap in place for Cluster API. But I think for the rest of the sub projects, because it does gate people's adoption, they see the alpha and they just don't want to engage because there's a connotation associated with that.
And nowadays, the mindset is so changed that alpha in production is not something that people object. As long as somebody makes a joke on Twitter, everybody's happy. Everybody use alpha. I come from a slightly different mindset, but yeah, it feels arbitrary compared to something like kubeproxy, which is still alpha. And in fact, I'm making a proposal to SIG Network to treat the kubeproxy config as GA if we want to deprecate it. It's alpha, but it's used everywhere. So if you want to deprecate it, it has to be 1 year at least for this alpha version. And it becomes a question like, if this has been alpha for so long, is it actually already beta? It's just the same happened for the CRI specification. It has been alpha for so long, everybody's using the CRI spec already. But what they did is just they jump promoted it to V1. So the CRI spec is now V1. Just nobody was promoting the API. Yeah, because saying that.
Yeah, it's just as a data point, like not this isn't necessarily universal, but like GA v1 does sort of signal to consumers that this is ready for prime time, like this has gone through the ringer. Not that it necessarily will never change. Like obviously we have semantic versioning and we can do v2s and stuff. But like just as a data point, like EKS, again, this is Kubernetes core, not so much the cluster API necessarily, or even etcd atom here, but like EKS doesn't enable alpha features as a pretty strict policy, just because it's very hard to like turn something off. That's kind of why the AWS APIs don't change. So while Kubernetes API could change, enabling alpha features for EKS is part of it's about stability, part of it's about like continuity. But there are like consumers out there who sort of expect things to sort of be able to stand up to something. So GA does not to like to rush anything, but it does signal to users that like this is really ready.
Yeah, I'm happy to hear that people still believe in not using APIs that are not officially graduated to V1. Yeah, also rushing things to V1 is not a bad idea, and I think that there's always V2 after V1, so things change. If you have something that has been used for a lot of time, for a long time by a lot of people, maybe it's time to graduate it to V1 and think about V2 in the future, something like that. Okay. Any more questions for etcd ADM and this API discussion? Cool. Does anybody have any other group topics they want to discuss?
If folks wanted to go through the details of etcd management, I think now is a good, if they felt like they wanted to hang out and chat about it, I think now is a good time. Other folks could drop if they feel like it.
Yeah, for the particular etcd ADM integration, we can discuss it tomorrow in the Cluster API meeting. I'm also curious what we are going to do with kubeadm, but that's like a separate process. Ideally, we are going to need a cap, the upstream Kubernetes cap for that. It's going to be interesting. I think the main couple of points for etcd ADM adoption for kubeadm was that we wanted the configuration file support so that we can let users pipe a configuration file from some file on disk. Pipe etcd ADM configuration from a file on disk all the way to the etcd ADM binary. And the kubeadm binary was going to deploy the etcd ADM binary. We also wanted the static pod use case, which I think is not that complicated to add. I think the config is more complex. But other than those two things, these two things, I don't really remember anything else for the kubeadm etcd ADM adoption. Just in terms of COPS, do you plan to integrate etcd manager into etcd ADM and then go back and start using it in COPS?
I think yes and yes, with a little bit of nuance. The idea is that etcd manager will be a sort of self-driving layer that that is actuating etcd ADM commands. So you will always be able to like see what it is doing for you, and we will try to express things in terms of things you could have typed yourself. The plan is to do that live, as it were. So etcd manager will shortly KOps clusters will shortly be running etcd manager from this repo, and we will move that repo. We will move etcd manager in that repo to use more and more of etcd ADM and less of its own thing. Because it has its own, like, current etcd manager has its own, I guess you call it like a fairly direct wrapper around etcd. It's called etcd server or something, but like it's currently like just a class rather than a separate binary, and the idea is to basically replace that with etcd ADM, or at least unify the two.
I see. Well, that's a good one. Yeah. Rajeshri?
Yeah, so I wanted to ask that in this rebase, or when etcd manager is being built from etcd ADM, will that change the way etcd ADM is used, like the init or join commands? Like, will that undergo any changes?
I don't think it will have. I don't think so. I think we're going to try to keep the basic flow unless someone wants to change things there. I think what it will add is the ability to, like, what we need in KOps is the ability to spin up an auto-scaling group, an AWS auto-scaling group, and have it like self init and join. Like, we don't have an external manager to do that for us. Like, Cluster API is interesting because it does have that external source of truth. etcd manager is built for a world where there is no external source of truth, where you can power off everything, power it all back on, and it will all come back.
Can I speak?
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, so my understanding is simplifying this as imperative versus declarative. So the closed loop for the etcd manager is to be able to support the what you call the CRDs and the way we would do declaratively things instead of doing it on command line, like etcd ADM or kube ADM. Is that correct? I just wanted to.
That is correct. It's slightly complicated by the fact that in terms of model, it's absolutely correct. There is no CRD for etcd there is no real CRD for etcd manager because there's no API server at that time. So again, this is where Cluster API becomes interesting, because there is now an API server. So KOps sort of has CRDs, but they live on an S3 bucket. Cluster API is real CRDs, and so we could presumably have a real CRD in Cluster API, whereas that is not as readily available to etcd manager, which intends to support S3 buckets as the API server, as it were.
Thanks, that helps.
Okay, any more questions on this topic?
We meet on Mondays. So on, what is it, 6 days is our next meeting, I think.
Yeah, let me show it on the calendar. Unfortunately, it's really a bad time for me, so I haven't been joining for a very long time. Is it?
It wasn't yesterday. It's next. It's in 6 days. It's bi-weekly in 15 and 29. So it should be on. Yeah, there it is.
Yeah. So it's. I mean, it's my time. You should just check it. It's in the community calendar.
It's 9 a.m. Pacific, I think.
Yeah. Now it's a bit confusing with the time zones. Yep. I see. Craig on the call. Me and Craig Peters yesterday discussed on a private Slack discussion the support for the Windows control plane. Craig, do you want to talk about this here, or is it like a topic for the like the SIG Windows meeting?
Anybody who's interested, I'm happy to talk about it. Lubomir reached out and was asking if Microsoft had any kind of user signal or intent around having sort of Windows only clusters where all of the management components and add-ons and things would run in Windows hosts. And the bulk of our users, run on AKS, which manages most of the control plane, so that it's not really a big concern to the users. There are obviously add-ons that don't work on Windows, and so they need to have some Linux nodes as a part of their clusters that sometimes provide some challenges to those users who are just not familiar with operating Linux machines. So there's some interest in that. It's not something for our users that we've kind of risen to the highest priority, but I'm very interested in hearing if other users are seeing a large demand for that. I guess I'll also note that we have other, Microsoft has other products that use Kubernetes on Windows hosts, and to solve this problem, we essentially run Linux VMs to run those components, and that's working just great.
Yeah, to provide some context on the side of VMware, we have seen some customers want this, but the overall demand has not been very high. And I was curious, like, what is the case and whether we should maybe start investing time to solve this problem. And quite frankly, the kubelet was the most complicated component. We got the kubelet working, which means that maybe the rest of the control plane components will be fairly easy to set up. And I wonder if maybe someday someone can just do the experiment if it works, and we can just convince SIG release that they should push the Windows container images or another external process doing that. It's a matter of experiment, and I can try joining the SIG Windows meeting and discussing more this topic more to see what they think about it.
I think.
Do we have any?
I think
Sorry.
that's worth discussing. I think it's not really about the rest of the control plane. I think that actually wouldn't be a problem at all. It's really about the rest of the ecosystem components and Prometheus and so on. That's where very few of those components run well on Linux. I mean, we've invested a lot in getting Envoy on Windows. We've invested a lot in getting Envoy to run well on Windows. But for service mesh scenarios, but beyond that, there's a significant investment to get the rest of the ecosystem there.
This is going to make a lot of those Windows administrators comfortable if especially they don't have to context switch between operating systems. So maybe it's a good idea to try to invest time into it, but I guess everything is going to be driven by SIG Windows, and it's probably the best forum for this discussion. I just wanted to show this topic to this group. Do we have anyone with comments on this? All right. If you're interested in this topic, I think we have a SIG Windows meeting in 40 minutes.
That's correct.
All right. Any more topics for today? Final call.
If there is still time, I would like to just ask a few questions about the HCD ADM and cluster API integration that I was talking about earlier.
Sure, we have 10 minutes.
Okay. So for the proposal, you said that there should be use cases of why there would be an external HCD cluster. And I could just think of this one use case, that the kube ADM config, it does support under cluster configuration. It does have options to either use local HCD or external HCD endpoints, like you were saying earlier. And I see that since cluster API doesn't right now provision and manage this external HCD cluster, that can be one use case, that just managing this external HCD cluster that you can give to your cluster configuration, that can be one use case. But other than that, yeah, I'm not sure how many use cases should the KEP or should the issue contain. Yeah.
I think the template has something like two or three. The explanation is, I think you should explain why this is needed in terms of topology, because in the external, the networking between the nodes, like why would somebody prefer that over the stock case where kubeadm deploys the etcd on the same node? It's obviously a better high availability support. If you have an external etcd cluster, we consider this to be like one level better HA than the stock case. But this is this you can talk about. It's like, hey, it's better high availability if you have an external etcd cluster. Here is how we can manage it. This is the external key. Did you see it?
Yeah.
It's pretty simple. And by the way, a fun fact is that currently the Rancher Kine project, Kine is a shim. It's a KINE. This project is used to shim etcd and use something like a MySQL as the storage backend for Kubernetes. They got it. They got kubeadm working with it by feeding external etcd here. So they feed external etcd. They have a local endpoint where Kine is listening to, and they use a MySQL backend. So kubeadm already was for some reason flexible with supporting that. I just wanted to mention this.
Yeah, Prakash here. I think multi-tenancy for the HCD can be a good use case. I'll look into it, but because once you have externalized, then the RBAC can be managing different HCD with a different roles. So that besides HA, which is what Justin mentioned, I think, and multi-tenancy is one more use case which you can add possibly.
Well,
Something.
I don't think RBAC is important for what we're discussing, because this is not authorization layer. This is authentication and a connection between hosts.
I think Prakash meant etcd RBAC, right? Or etcd ACLs.
That's right. That's right.
etcd has ACLs. They added it sometime in like 3.0 or something.
Okay, I see.
They have authorization
Yeah.
structures. Wow, fascinating. So I can control who has permissions to a particular key.
If they're talking directly to etcd, yes. I don't know if this is a good idea on your API server, but yes. I mean, yeah, like what Prakash was saying, like if you have two different API servers and you want to share an etcd cluster, that would be supported. That would be a good idea. I'm not sure you should use it as a supplement for RBAC if that's what you're going, like for Kubernetes RBAC, if that's what you're going for.
I have not seen the use case to control that from Kubernetes.
Yeah, it would be weird.
Yeah. It's like some fascinatingly granular control.
Oh, by the way, I also put it in chat, but in case you didn't see it, there's another project called Cluster API Provider Nested, which is bringing up etcd in the control plane, in the management cluster, I guess you'd call it. So they run as a stateful set. So that is probably the easiest way to understand like the various way the keys and stuff have to flow. But of course, it's not using etcd ADM or anything like that. But it's a good reference. So the link is there.
So this is also using the stacked topology, right? Like etcd components on control plane nodes, or?
This is using etcd running as pods in a management cluster, is my understanding. I don't know what bucket you put that in terms of like topologies, but it's a different topology.
Okay.
Yeah, it's running the whole control plane in pods on the management cluster. And there's a pending proposal for it, because we created the repository for the project first, but the proposal that actually explains why we need this was created later. So I think the project is still about to explain why it exists in a way. And I can see some very interesting test cases, at least, using it for end-to-end test signal. Okay, any more questions? We have 3 minutes. All right, let's call it a meeting. Thank you, everybody. See you again in a couple of weeks. Bye.